So what you've got to hope for is that you have MPs that are comfortable talking to people of all different backgrounds. That's the core skill in my job. Can I knock on the door on Bishop's Walk or knock on the door on the Fieldway estate and feel equally comfortable talking to those people about what they want to talk to me about and going into their homes and trying to help them? And you'll have to form your own opinion about whether you think I'm the kind of person that can do that.
I was just curious about why, because grammar schools were taken away from Croydon. Is there nothing being about bringing them back at all?
Well, Croydon Council wanted to set up, you can't set up new grammar schools, it's illegal. The law doesn't allow the establishment of new grammar schools. What you can do is you can set up satellites of existing grammar schools. And as I understand it, Croydon Council actually had a conversation with the governors of this school about whether it would like to set up a satellite in Croydon. And actually, for whatever reasons, they decided at this moment in time that wasn't the right thing for this school. But longer term, the current Conservative administration and Croydon Council would love there to be grammar school provision in Croydon.
I'm glad you're wearing a green tie today. Bearing in mind, I mean, can you as a Conservative in Croydon really talk about environmental issues anymore after you lied about proposing supplements?
Okay, well, there's two light-hearted things I say to you at the start. One is people read enormous significance into the colour of the ties that I wear, which I find a rather bizarre thing. I have ties of all colours. On the incinerator, I certainly didn't lie because I never made any promises about it at all. I think what you're alluding to, there was a leaflet that was put out by the candidates in Waddingwood, which said that they would be opposed to an incinerator built in Croydon or near the borders. And both the current plan in Bennington break that promise. One of the things I would say to all of you, putting aside my own party politics, is when there's a policy that politicians of all parties do when they're in power, but oppose when they're not in power, there may be good reasons for that policy. So the incinerator, whatever your views on it, is supported by a Labour administration in Merton, a Lib Dem administration in Kingston and Sutton, and a Conservative administration in Croydon. So if you get politicians from all parties supporting something when they're actually in power, having to make the right decisions, but all opposing it when they're aware they're in opposition, because it's politically clearly not necessarily a very popular thing to do, that's suggesting that there may actually be good arguments for it. The reality is, we've got to find some way of dealing with our rubbish. Burying it in a hole in the ground is not a great solution. I would show you the evidence of what that, if you want to come and see it. There's a school in northwest Croydon called Archbishop Land Front, which is built on an old landfill site. It's currently collapsing because there's gas coming up from the ground. So burying the rubbish in a hole in the ground is not a great environmental solution. The best solution is to use less rubbish and to recycle what can be recycled. But there are some things we can't recycle and we have to dispose of them somehow. And burning them and recovering energy from that process, from the scientific evidence I've seen, is the least bad way of dealing with the problem in my opinion.
Any questions from any year 10s or year 11s?
With the famous 80 Conservatives all around who regularly vote against European issues, would that be a failure of Whigs in general?
So I just heard the end of your question. Were you saying there's a lot of Conservative MPs who regularly vote against European issues?
Regularly vote against Europe.
Yeah, well look, Whigs will always tell you we want all of our MPs to vote for all of our measures. But I think one has to recognise that the European issue is an issue that divides certainly both of the main parties and even the Lib Dems a bit. I think the divisions are most acute within the Conservative Party, but actually there are Eurosceptics in both the other parties as well. And that's really why David Cameron has come up with this proposal to have a referendum. Because the reality is, we actually took the decision originally to go into Europe round about when I was born. And there was a referendum quite soon after that, in I think it was 1975. And it never settled the issue. Partly, I think, because there's increasing numbers of people, you'll soon be some of them, who are eligible to vote who never had the chance to have their say back then. And partly because what Europe is has changed over that time as it's taken on more and more powers from the nation states. So actually, the thing that really unites the Conservative Party is, we don't agree on the substance of the issue, but we do agree that the way to resolve this issue is to have a national debate, have a referendum, allow the people of this country to take a decision about it, and then respect that decision. And I think that is what will happen in the end. Whether it will happen at the next election, at the moment we're the only party offering that at the next election. So whether it will happen after the next election will depend on the result of that election. But my view is that ultimately, long term, that's the only way to solve the debate.
Can I put to you, a lot of students here watched the LBC debate on Wednesday. Why wasn't David Cameron?
Well, I think probably David Cameron's view is that this isn't the moment to have the debate because we're not at the referendum yet. To a degree, Clegg and Farage sit on the extremes of this debate. Clegg's view is whatever is going on in Europe, we should always stay in it. And Farage's view is everything that the EU does is terrible and we should get out. And he was trying, I didn't watch the debate, I watched Liverpool play football, but from what I understand of what he said, he was actually blaming the EU for Vladimir Putin invading Ukraine, or invading Crimea, which just struck me as bizarre. So these are two people that sit right on the poles of the debate. Cameron's view is that what he should do is to try and negotiate with our European partners, and he's not happy with the relationship at the moment. Can we change it? But then when he's got a deal that he thinks is a good deal, to come back to you, to your parents, and say, right, I think this is a good package, and on the basis of this, I think we should stay in. What do you think? And try and settle the issue that way. And it's, I think it would be politically, as well as intellectually, I think it would be a mistake for him or for the Conservative Party to allow this issue to dominate the general election next year. To me, the dominant issue of the general election is about our economy. That is the dominant issue. The dominant issue that faces us as a country is dealing with our debts and making sure that we grow our economy, create the jobs so that when you all graduate, there are good opportunities there.
So, economic research has shown that the current tuition fee policy is economically better than the previous one, only if less than 48% of people who apply for loans defaulting them. But recent government figures have stated that they expect at least 45% rate of default with the current student loan system. And this puts into doubt the government's economic justification for the tuition policy. So my question to you is, do you think that it's time for the government to reconsider its tuition fee policy considering the new economic evidence that has come to light?
Well, it's always right for the government to reflect on evidence when it's deciding what its policies should be. The thing I would say to you is that I think there were two main arguments for the change that was made in relation to tuition fees. One was about trying to ensure that our universities were on a sustainable financial footing, because just in the way that I was answering this gentleman's question and saying that all of you are competing with young people from all over the world, our universities are competing with universities from all over the world to get the best academics, to attract the best students, to get the investment in terms of their research facilities. So it's very important. It's one of the UK's great strengths, our universities. We're probably second only to the United States in terms of the international higher education market. So that was one part of justification, and the other was about making a contribution towards dealing with our debts by saving the government money and shifting more of the cost of higher education onto the people that benefit from it and off the taxpayer as a whole. So even if over time the predictions about the percentage of people that are not going to fully repay their debt prove to have been optimistic, that only affects the second of those justifications. The first one remains very strong. But I think what we need to do is look at it over time and make a judgment. To me, the principles are we must ensure that our higher education system is well resourced because it's one of Britain's great strengths. And we also need to ensure that there is a fair system which both shares the cost between those of you that are going to benefit from a higher education and the taxpayer as a whole, but is also fair in the sense of giving you confidence that if you go to university and you don't end up with a high-paying job, you're not going to have unaffordable bills, so it's not going to put off anyone from going to university who has the ability to go.
Do you have anything to add on that?
Well, I just want to talk because you say there are two justifications. Second is the economic one, but in terms of the first one, Asian governments such as the Chinese one, the universities are increasingly wanting because the government is putting much more investment into those universities. So wouldn't it be more logical for the government to prioritise spending on universities due to this to be able to retain UK's high standing and the high standing of UK's universities?
Well, in an ideal world, yes, obviously. But the problem is, I don't think the government has done a good enough job of explaining to people of your age why it's done this. So actually, if you look at how the government is going about reducing our deficit, broadly speaking, there are two budgets that are increasing: health and overseas aid. There's one that overall is frozen, which is the education budget. And within that, there's actually a bit more money going into nursery education. The school budget up to 16 is basically frozen at inflation level. It's not increasing or falling. And the hit, as it were, falls post-16 in terms of EMA and tuition fees. And the rationale for that, the sort of fairness argument for that, is that if you accept my point that we currently have a very unfair education system in this country, the evidence shows that when you're 4 years old and you arrive at reception at primary school, there is already a 1-year gap in attainment from the kids from the best backgrounds and the worst backgrounds. So you want to make Britain a fairer country. The place where you really need to put any spare money you've got is in the early years, to try and close that gap earlier on. And it's very difficult in the constraints budget to justify putting a lot more money into HE. And that's why the government's ended up with this policy. Knowing that it's not going to be very popular, but the belief is if we've got any spare money to invest in education, it needs to go early on to try and tackle that unfairness from the start.
Will, what's your personal opinion
As a place?
on
On the EU? Right. Well, look, I think the first thing where I take issue with some of my colleagues is sometimes we conflate talking about Europe and the EU. So my starting point would be the countries that are our neighbours in Europe are key allies of ours, they're our friends, we have important historical ties and very important economic ties with them, and we should always start by making that point clearly. These are key allies of the UK that we want to have good relations with and want to cooperate with. The issue is, how far do we want to go beyond that in terms of actually amalgamating, sharing sovereignty, or whatever you want to call it, but allowing transnational institutions to take decisions that are then binding on the individual countries within them. And my view is that's gone too far. And it's gone too far because I think actually in terms of democracy, it doesn't work at the EU level. You know, the numbers of people that will participate in the European parliamentary elections on the 22nd of May are pretty low. And those that do will generally use it as an opportunity to protest vote rather than expressing a view about the legislation that is being conducted in the EU and who they want to make those decisions. So my starting point would be we should be identifying those things that can only be done at the European level, so the rules to make the single market work. If you want to deal with endangered fishing in the North Sea, or you want to deal with pollution that drifts across national boundaries, some things like that have to be done at the EU level. I've got no problem with that. At the moment, too much is being done there. To give a good example, there is a directive called the Working Time Directive that sets a limit on the number of hours that anyone can be required to work in a week. Now, there may or may not be a case for having a law that does that, but I see no reason why that law has to be the same in Estonia as in the UK. So I would like to see fewer things decided there. And then there are other issues where I'm very happy for us to work together, but on the basis of unanimity. So for example, if you take the Ukraine, if all the countries in the EU have a common view, actually it makes great sense to have one person who goes and talks to the Russians about that representing the 28 member countries, because they'll have a lot more clout than each of us going as individuals. But that should only happen where there is common agreement. The other thing is, I don't think we should get it out of perspective. One of the things that makes me a conservative is a scepticism, not a hostility, but a scepticism about government. Because I would say to all of you that as you go through your adult lives, one of the things you should look out for is any institution will always try and grab more power for itself. Our government does it, our local councils do it, and the EU does it. And then you need to resist that and actually say, well, do you need to be doing, actually, do we need 2 sites for the European Parliament? And do we need all of the sort of bureaucracy that has grown up around the Commission? Can't we slim that down a bit and focus back on the things that need to be done collectively? So my broad view would be, I'm in favour of membership, but I would like to see less done at the European level than at present.
Gavin, if you wouldn't mind just keeping the answers to
Sorry.
so we get through as many as we can.
On that point, 2 very small questions, slightly related. The EU issue has come to make UKIP a key allow a voice in this issue as well for listening to them. And also talking about coalition politics, because of them as well. My question is, if in the forthcoming election, the option comes to most Conservative MPs, do you think they go for a Conservative UKIP, a coalition of Conservative?
I can't answer for most of my colleagues, I've not had the conversation. So I can just give you my view. I have no interest in working in coalition with UKIP. I think they are certainly some of the leading figures within them. I'm not talking about all the people that vote for them, have rather unpleasant views that I don't wish to associate myself with. So when I hear Nigel Farage talking about getting a train from central London to South London and feeling uncomfortable because there are people on the train not speaking English, that to me is pandering to racists. I've got no interest in working with those people.
We haven't even finished yet. James.
3 years ago, and this is more...
Your name James?
No. This is a more local issue, but 3 years ago I very optimistically joined your Project Change, I don't know if you remember, and it was committed to galvanising public interest and trying to redefine the image of young people in Croydon and so on and so forth. We did loads of things like running marathons and painting subways and whatever it was, but I think that you'd agree that 3 years, nearing 3 years on, all you have to do is get on the 250 toward from West Croydon to Brixton to figure out that very little has changed since the riots, and I'm interested to know why you've abandoned that desire to redefine the image of Croydon following the riots.
That's a very good question. I haven't abandoned it, is the answer, and actually we were having a discussion the other day about how to try and reignite it. One of the difficulties is that you were probably younger than the average person that got involved in that, and the difficulty we've had is that a number of the key people in it have gone on to university, and it's harder to recruit people now with the memory of the riots 2 or 3 years older than it was in the immediate aftermath, where I think a lot of people were galvanised to see what could be done. But actually we were having, and perhaps you could have a word with Mario at the end, we were having a discussion in the office the day before yesterday about how to try and reignite that, and maybe looking at the idea of having a magazine and a website that will publicise the achievements of young people in Croydon across a broad range of fields as a way of trying to do that. So I'd be very interested in talking to you about it afterwards. It's still something I feel very strongly about.
Mr. Mark.
Yeah, you gave us a kind of overview of the demographics of your constituency, which is really, really interesting to see the kind of the contrast that exists within the constituency as a whole. Obviously, if the Conservatives are going to win an outright majority, they're going to have to win more constituencies with the profile of Croydon Central. And as you say, at the moment, your constituency, to a degree, stands out as quite a rare one. I just wonder what you think needs to be done, maybe drawing on your own experiences, to convince those sections of the electorate and those constituencies with similar profiles that you're the party for them.
I can't give a short answer to this. I'll do my best. So the starting point is to ask, why did the Conservative Party not win an overall majority last time? Very simply, I would posit 3 reasons. Performed terribly in Scotland. Didn't win back enough Liberal Democrat seats that historically would have been Conservative. This is a good example. And didn't perform well enough in urban areas. Why? Bluntly, because urban areas have very significant black and minority ethnic communities, and the Conservative Party historically does very badly on them. So those are the 3 things that you've got to tackle. I can't, in the time available, deal with all 3 of those, so I'm going to concentrate on the last one, which is the one that I know most about. And it seems to me that the starting point is to say that nearly everybody, whatever their ethnicity or religion, their fundamental concerns are the same. In terms of an economy that creates jobs, good health service, good schools, safety, all of those issues. The reason the Conservative Party has this problem is in the 1960s and 1970s and 1980s, it gave the impression that it wasn't really that keen from people outside of the old Commonwealth coming to this country. And therefore it essentially cut itself off. Perfectly understandably, people then said, well, if that's your view, we're not very keen on voting for you. So the first answer to your question is to accept that changing that is going to take a significant effort. It is not going to happen in a 2-month election campaign. And so what I try and do in my seat is, from the moment that I got elected, I've tried to give the impression to people that where there are no bits of Croydon Central that I am not interested in representing. When I was selected as a candidate, I was told not to bother campaigning in New Addington. They're all Labour up there. It's nonsense. We now have a councillor in Leamington for the first time in 40 years. Recruit people, and I spend being backgrounds into the party. And quite often when you talk to people, they'll sort of say, well, you're not what I expect from a Conservative. So it is about changing perceptions. I think the problem the party has in doing this is that because most MPs, most Conservative MPs represent rural areas of Britain that don't have big BME communities, they don't see the importance of doing it because they presume the rest of the country is like their seat, which is not. And they therefore also don't have a clear idea about what needs to be done to go about doing it. But I think it is going to take a sort of profound 10-year effort to do it. And I think you can see in some of the things the Prime Minister is doing now, the start of that. So I would take great pride from the fact that the last Conservative government shamefully refused to have a public inquiry into the death of Stephen Lawrence. This one, when further allegations have come to light, has launched a further public inquiry. Airline passenger duty was a measure in the budget, which actually, something I've been lobbying behind the scenes for, significantly affects people who've got family in South Asia or the Caribbean, because the banding system the last government introduced massively penalised people flying to those destinations. So you're beginning to see the government addressing issues that historically the Conservative Party wouldn't have addressed. But you shouldn't imagine that people are going to just change long-standing voting habits overnight. They're going to want to see that that change is sustained and permanent.
I just wanted to ask a question talking about the economic situation that we're in at the moment. Reports suggest that the richest 5 families in the UK are more well off than the lowest 20%. We have 3,500 people using food banks, and I mean, what would you say about the government's economic policy? Not raising the top rate of income tax, for example, which would only affect a minority of people, and the harsh cuts to benefits and other welfare payments.
Okay, well, I would say several things in response to that. The first is, one of my main critiques about people on the left is they define a fair tax system by the rates that you charge, which is insane, absolutely insane. If you go back and Google JFK in America, not a Conservative, he gives a great speech about what matters on tax policy is not the rates, but the actual income that you're raising. And that if you have tax rates too high, it incentivises people to move money offshore or employ accountants to find ways of hiding their money so they actually pay less tax. This government, every single year of this government, we have raised a bigger percentage of income tax from the wealthiest in society than in any of the 13 years of the Labour government, despite cutting the top rate of tax by 5p. So don't look at rates, look at whether the system is fair in terms of the amounts of money that people are actually paying. In terms of the benefit system, I would divide the things that we've done into 2 categories. There are some things that I voted for that I'm very proud to have voted for, and I would have done even if there was no deficit. So, for example, we've introduced what's called a benefit cap. And what that says, if you're a family where there's no one working, there is a limit on the amount of benefits you can get. And the limit is £26,000 a year, which is the equivalent of a salary, because you don't pay tax on benefit. It's equivalent of a salary of £35,000 a year.
Isn't that only for a household?
That's a household salary, household income equivalent of £35,000 a year, which is the average household income for the country. So our starting point is that people that are not working should not be given a significantly better standard of living than many of the people that are working and are paying the taxes to fund those benefits. That, I think, is fair, is just, and I would completely defend that. There are some other changes we've made to benefits, which I wouldn't have wanted to do, but I think are justified in the circumstances that we're in. And the reality is, I can make all of you the Chancellor of the Exchequer. The welfare budget takes up 40% of all that the government spends. So if you're not going to touch the welfare budget and you're not going to touch the NHS budget, you're going to impose swinging cuts on every other thing. The reality is you've got to find some ways of making savings in that budget, but doing it without removing the fundamental safety net that we would all want to have in a civilised society.
Junior.
With the recent party leaders coming out and saying how they want to reform Prime Minister's questions, and like reports as well that say how whips almost as if like after Prime Minister's questions they'll be texting MPs like thank you for the wall of noise and how they contribute to the to all the cheering. How much do you feel that whips actually contribute to that kind of atmosphere?
Quite a bit. Quite a bit. But the difficult thing is, how do you go from where we are now, which I think, who here thinks Prime Minister's Questions is good the way it is? Okay, some. And who thinks it's way too noisy and a bit pathetic? Majority. Alright? If you want to go from where we are now to a different world, it's very difficult because it takes both sides to do it. And actually when David Cameron, if you go back and look, when David Cameron became leader of the opposition, he spoke about trying to change PMQs. And for the first 6 to 9 months, he tried to avoid the sort of standard soundbite questions and ask more probing, intellectual questions and change the atmosphere. And what happened was the Labour Party carried on the way they were, and all the journalists wrote up that he was losing each time because they were making lots of noise and our side weren't. So the difficulty is getting an agreement to try and change the way it works. One of the things that I would say to you is that if you had a PMQs where nobody barracked or cheered and they just got up, asked a question and gave an answer, it would actually be a bit boring. What you've got at the moment is wrong because it's too much of it is synthetic. So I think what you actually would like is a PMQs where when people say something that offends you or that you really agree with, you react to that, but there isn't a sort of synthesised level of it. How do you get from this point to that point? That's the difficulty with it.
You talked about one of the main Conservative issues in the last election was not getting enough seats in Scotland. I was just wondering what your thoughts were on the upcoming Scottish independence.
Well, it's quite an interesting question, that, because it's a good example of politicians doing something that's completely contrary to their self-interest. I think that those people that are cynical about politics think all politicians do is what's in their interest all the time. The Conservative Party's selfish political interest would be in Scotland voting yes, because they're all Labour MPs apart from one. There's a few Nationalists, a few Lib Dems and one Conservative and all the rest are Labour. So we would win nearly every election without Scotland in the UK. However, the Conservative Party, those of you that have studied politics will know, its full name is the Conservative and Unionist Party. We believe in the Union and we want Scotland to stay in the Union. The difficulty for us, I think, is getting involved in it too much is probably counterproductive. You know, Alex Salmond is constantly trying to draw David Cameron into the debate because David Cameron's the sort of bogeyman that Alex Salmond wants in that debate. And actually we need to make sure that we need to leave it as a debate that's resolved within Scotland. My own view, how many of you study history here as well as politics? Right. Okay. The reality is England on its own would not have been able to intervene in the way that it did in World War I or World War II. The world would be a much worse place than it is if you'd not had this union. And I think that the 4 countries have achieved great things together, and it would be a great shame to break it up, in my opinion. But it's ultimately a decision the Scottish people are going to have to take.
We've got time for just one more question. More for
in the 2010 campaign, Conservative campaign, one of the main points was Conservative support for the environment and keeping the environment. Cameron said stuff like, "Oh, vote blue, go green,"
Yeah.
but then he's been quoted around number 10 saying, "Oh, let's forget all this green crap." Obviously, he denied that, but he went on to go against one of his main proposals in the 2010 campaign. He said to the constituents around the Heathrow area that we're not going to expand because there's going to be too much noise, basically because it won't benefit the people there. But then he now went on to say that this place is too full, so we have to expand. I want to ask you, what exactly is the Conservative view on the environment going into the next election?
Okay. Well, first of all, on Heathrow, he hasn't taken a decision to expand it. What he has done is set up a commission to look at how we can provide more airport capacity in the southeast. So it'll be interesting what the next Conservative manifesto says about that, but no decision has been specifically taken on that. More generally, I think a sort of strong concern for the environment has always been an important part of Conservatism. Those of you that have studied the political ideology, part of it is about preserving for future generations what we've benefited from, whether that's our constitution or our environment. But that has to be balanced against the need to grow the economy and the need to provide houses, so that when you want to have your own house, you're not having to pay a prohibitive price for it. So it's about, politics often is not easy. It's about striking the right balance between competing objectives. And so what we have to look at in relation to environmental policy, for example, one of the great tensions is over energy prices. So there are some people who would say, well, actually, jacking up energy prices is a good thing, because it will force people to use less energy, that's business. And I think often in terms of the media coverage of politics, one of the things that is lost is that that sense of politics about not being simple and actually about finding the right trade-offs between what are often difficult and competing pressures. I often think that some of the coverage significantly underestimates how difficult the Prime Minister's job is, because on any given day he's jumping between dealing with the Ukraine crisis and then checking whether the manifesto commitment in relation to school places is being delivered from one issue to another issue to another issue. And quite often these different pressures are pointing in different directions, and government's about striking the right balance between them. But I would want to reassure you that a sort of concern for the environment, and particularly for dealing with climate change, which I think is one of the most serious long-term threats we face as a society, is something that the government does take very, very seriously.
Just before we end, we did this when we had Tom Brake visit. Gavin, I'm going to give you 1 minute to tell us why we should vote Tory in 2015. Alice, are you going to try and help us?
Go. Well, the first thing I'd say is that you should vote. It's important that you vote. But in terms of why I would encourage you to vote Conservative, I think that the fundamental challenge that we face as a country is growing our economy while dealing with our debts. And the last government dug us into a hole which you're going to spend the first 20 years of your working life paying off the debt that they built up. We've made a real progress in starting to pay back that money, but the job isn't done yet. And if you look at the main alternative, which is the Labour Party, they are led by the people that made those mistakes in the first place and have been proved wrong in this Parliament about how to deal with the rest. You may be attracted by other parties, but ultimately the choice is David Cameron versus Ed Miliband. Who's the best person to lead the country? And I would argue, and the opinion polls I think back me up, that David Cameron is streets ahead on that test.
Okay, so thank you.
And I say thank you to all of you for giving up your lunchtime. Some really good questions, and I hope there might be an occasion, certainly for those of you that are studying the subject, where I can come along and we can have a bit more discussion on some of that.
Definitely. Thanks again.
Okay, thank you.